projects you want to go after, and do people come to you, or do you know what you need?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah, so the question was, how do I choose projects? How do I figure out what projects to go after? It's a little bit of a complicated matrix. Many times it's partner organizations that I've worked with or that I've worked to establish a relationship with, and I know them well and they know me well, and we understand that we work well together, because trying to work with organizations that are not good partners is very tricky. A lot of the time, as a faculty member, many of these things are driven by students. So I might have a student come to me and say, I really want to do this, or I really want to do that, and I have this great idea, and so on. And then I can assess how well that fits with the range of interests that I have. At the moment, I have three main topics: health, privacy, and intimate partner violence. And so as long as it's kind of within that framework, those students will often be the start for these research directions. And then it's about sort of broadening the portfolio. So here, I came to New York about 2.5 years ago to work at Cornell Tech, and really wanted to engage with the city and do some work here, and realized that there's this really interesting technical challenge around having physical access to a device that has both very interesting technical questions and potentially good social impact. And so, those factors together kind of made this one worth pursuing. I'm very fortunate that I often have many more potential projects that I could do than time to do them, so I have to try and say no to things that might be amazingly cool. It's a good problem to have. Yes?
Two questions. One is the source code or the code for that, checking to see if you have spyware on your phone available. And then the second one, are you doing anything with like Internet of Things where people remotely control like lights or temperature?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first question was, is the tool for scanning spyware publicly available? I believe it is online. We're making some changes to it for our upcoming field study. So it's likely to be a pre-release, and then it will be a more better release, and then certainly as we do our field study to validate a lot of stuff, it will update, but it is all publicly available. The second question, I forgot.
Internet of Things?
Oh, the Internet of Things, right. So the Internet of Things, which is all these like light switches that can be controlled, or garage doors, or baby monitors that can be controlled remotely, present a huge new range of challenges in this intimate partner violence setting. We are not looking at anything specifically yet. It's definitely on the to-do list once we get through some of this initial stuff. I think it hasn't yet become something that the survivors we work with are talking about. So most of the time in this study that we did, where we spoke with 39 survivors and 50 professionals, the vast majority of things were phone-based. We saw a lot of GPS trackers. We saw some cases where people had put trackers on cars or baby strollers or various things. We did not actually see a lot of IoT stuff, Internet of Things stuff manifesting yet. Obviously they are still a threat. So I think just as that becomes more a part of people's everyday lives, we will see more of it, and hopefully we can get ahead of taking care of some of those threats.
Yeah, there was an article in the New York Times and they talked about that.
Yeah. Our work was also covered in the New York Times recently. So it's a cool article.
A comment and a suggestion.
Great.
So first on the first two items, I know you talked about, I think you had the 4-point analyze, design, build, test, or something like that. And then you said your cycle was about over a year or something like that. And what I would suggest to you is, because that cycle is so long, okay, you really need to look at things on a meta level in terms of improving infrastructure, because by the time you get to succeeding, okay, you are then, if you look 20 years down the road, you're creating lots of silos. And the way you avoid silos and that type of growth is by looking early on towards common elements of infrastructure. So federal enterprise architecture, as a reference, would allow you to discover some of those things. And the second point on this, the third area of study here, which is very interesting, is that And just allow me to, as a technologist, computer scientist, just to depersonalize it just for a second, because these are horrific, things. I understand the human element of this. This is very much like employee and employer security. So if you take a look at counterterrorism training that businesses do, a lot of those types of approaches would help fix a lot of these problems. I'm not saying that you approach the abuser as a terrorist, but if you look at the way from a business process, how they approach these kinds of things, businesses have trusting relationships that you're really dependent upon that later on go south. And so that would be, an approach on that. And from a technology perspective, part of the reason why you're having difficulty on the app side there is the security models, especially on the iPhone is terrible, okay? And the Android is terrible for a different reason.
The Android is more terrible.
Right. Well, I'm just saying, they have different weaknesses. The reason why you don't get, progression on that is because of something completely unrelated, which is digital rights management. And the key thing that's important to Congress and Disney and all the media, creators is having DRM systems that can't be compromised. So movies can't be stolen. And that, from a computer science perspective and an engineering perspective, creates all of this cruft that you're working around. So
a couple things. So first of all, in the first two, we do typically work about 5 years ahead of what we anticipate will be the mainstream technology. So a lot of the work I do, for example, or have done, was working with smartphones in Africa 5 years ahead of smartphones showing up in Africa, just as an example. So we do definitely think about that. For the second one, there are still some fundamental differences. So we have looked at certainly sort of enterprise level security stuff, and my colleague Tom Ristenpart, who's a security and cryptography expert, focuses on a lot of that. There are still some fundamental differences in that it's really in a company's interests to set up much more coherent security architectures and whatnot as a business practice when they start. People don't tend to approach romantic relationships in the same way. There's often this trust that you fall in love and everything's great. So you're not necessarily, unless you're a very special type of person, setting that up. But it's an interesting area.
But I would say the need to know is a key thing that you need to socialize that would improve that, hey, I really can't give you my password.
Yeah, I mean, it just doesn't work. Humans just do share their passwords, they share it with their spouse and their kids, and it happens. The other thing just related to digital rights management is that we have done a bunch of work there, and we do work with people who are experts in that, mostly in the context of trying to assert rights management over intimate images so that you can have legal ways to get them taken down. But it is a really interesting dynamic around digital rights management to try and manage some of that content.
I'm saying the operating system and that integration causes a lot of the technology problems.
Other questions?
There's one here and then one there.
Hi, last month I started building a health tech startup company that very specifically addresses the gap, the canyon really between the LGBTQ community and culturally competent, safe, and comprehensive healthcare. And I was just wondering what your best strategies are to have sort of like the most and the best user up to when you do build up these networks and services.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. I think for the most part we have been, because we work specifically with organizations, we have been working with the kinds of clients that they have, and so when we talk about uptake, we're talking in this case about can New York City use it in their shelters and so on. We work a lot also with the National Network to End Domestic Violence, NNEDV, which has a much more national scale agenda to try and push it out there. For us, really, it's about trying to use these sorts of partnerships in ways that will get that scale and that reach, rather than me trying to know a bunch of people or do a bunch of stuff. And usually what I find is that, it's a network of things. So the NNEDV introduces us to the relevant people at Amnesty International, and they introduce us to the relevant people at the next place. And so there's a set of really big organizations that we try and take advantage of to release some of the stuff. And they're also just very hungry for the kinds of tools that we build. And so are very eager about, it's more like, is it done yet? Have you tested it yet? Tested it yesterday, and we're like, no, it takes time. And then we go to the students and we say, is it done yet?
Yeah. Some of your research work, if we want to prevent some of these things, either in health or social issues, you need to approach it at policy level, national and international both. Nothing is today isolated to a particular region or a country. Are these fed to those who are policy, because techies find there is no technical solution to some of these.
Yep.
I was deployed in prevention of Ebola in 2014, and every country, they have their own travel regulations, and there are some international regulations, and the spread, actually there was no medical solution to it. So there was no immunization or anything. And countries have their sovereign rights on trans-border movement based on their agreements with each other. And until unless, but no one has the right to spread a virus or epidemic from one country to another. So until unless we good research work are fed into policies of the government or international bodies, we won't be able to deal it at corporate level by having protection and security system and other technical solutions.
Yeah, so I approach this in a couple of different ways. Certainly a lot of the work I do, for example, with community health programs, is in direct partnership with government programs. And so they're the ones that are owning it and scaling it after the research is over, at least, so by working with them. In the case of this intimate partner violence stuff, it's similar just in that we partner with policy experts, and certainly the city has a lot, and so they then will take those findings and be able to advocate for these particular things in ways that can hopefully lead to policy change. For example, using digital rights management to advocate for someone's ability to take down non-consensual intimate imagery and so on. But doing these sorts of things and developing this evidence for what's happening is a crucial basic step to give those policymakers something to go and advocate about. They're not going to go and say anything in policy without some understanding of what's going on. So we're trying to say, like, here's what's going on, here's some of the things we can do about it, and then advocate at the policy level as to how we can integrate that in ways that can really protect people. But it's definitely, certainly I would never want to try and build technologies independently of policy or other broader ecosystems, and it's certainly a central component of my approach.
And is there enough collaboration, like Georgia Tech or Virginia Tech? They are doing a lot of work on health and humanitarian issues of this nature. And you collaborate so that we don't have too much duplications.
Oh yeah, no, we don't duplicate. There's too much work to do to duplicate things. But yes, I know a lot of people at those places, and we work on complementary things and work together if it makes sense.
Just curious, are there any other New York City projects or even Roosevelt Island projects you may be working on?
Yeah, so I work on another one. I don't have anything Roosevelt Island specific at this point. I think my colleague Tap Parikh has been busy taking advantage of all of the Roosevelt Island community organizations, so we don't want to overwhelm everybody. That said, so another project that I have at the moment that's really just getting started is looking at home care workers in the context of heart failure, which is a huge number, and we partner with the biggest union here of home care workers in the city. And home care workers spend a lot of time with heart failure patients. They are themselves a marginalized community, mostly women and minorities. They're largely ignored by healthcare systems. And so the hypothesis is that we really, again, a few years out, have an opportunity to try and investigate how we could equip them with technology that both amplifies their role in dealing with these things and also gives them some way of improving their health care of patients and their own job satisfaction and the health equity of that whole system. So that's another one that I have going on, but probably there are more happening. Yes?
Two questions. Are there any demographics onto the 5 boroughs where the concentration is higher? And then the other question, is there a feedback from Cuomo into maybe imposing regulations on these spywares? Is there any contact with his office?
Yeah, so the first one, the demographics, yes. I don't have them on the top of my head. They are in our paper that we published. In general, we had a very diverse group. As I said, a lot were from foreign countries. There were a lot of minorities. So a very diverse range, I would say, of demographics, as one might expect in New York. That's why we love New York. As far as the second question goes, we haven't, we as Cornell Tech haven't specifically interacted with the governor's office. We've worked extensively with the mayor's office. But there is a lot going on with some of the people in the space around trying to, redefine the legal system in ways that make some of this more serious. Up until now, it takes legal systems many years to catch up with technology, and so much of the things, many of the things that we're seeing now are kind of not considered to be dangerous because it's just old policies. And so there's a lot of work going on to try and update those. It takes time, and they need evidence for how it's going on. So the hope is that we can help with some of that in terms of showing what's happening, showing that it's dangerous, and getting that taken seriously by legal systems and then policy and so on.
The follow-up is the demographics. I also meant like the abuser and the victim. Were there always spouses, or were there like parents and their children, or other?
For the most part, we saw married couples who did have children. I would say that was the majority. Not exclusively. We did have a relatively strong component of LGBT people. We also had many who were just single, I would say, but it was a non-marriage relationship that had ended up badly. So there was some variation, but for the most part, we were looking at married people. And just to say, that's not an indication at all of the kinds of people who experience intimate partner violence. That might just be an indication of the kind of people who seek services through New York City's infrastructure. In many of these cases, they were receiving legal help for family court or criminal court cases. Many of those were then involving child custody. So a lot of the reason for the particular people that were involved in our study might just be because they were better suited to the kinds of services being offered, rather than because those are the people that really experience it more. So I think it occurs broadly in all corners of society, unfortunately.
I love what you're doing. It's fabulous. It's great that you have a team that's focused on an important thing. The question I have for you is really related to something I became aware of recently.
Could you speak in?
Sorry, cyberbullying in schools, especially in elementary and middle school. How does this address it? How does it all
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting that you asked. So the question was around cyberbullying and schools, and how does this extend or interact with that? There definitely are crossovers, and we're actually running another study at the moment, still focused more on the intimacy part, where we're looking at teen dating violence and the use of technology in teen dating as a thing. So it's closer to cyberbullying, I would say. A lot of it is similar in ways that it's account compromise. What's different is that it's more Snapchat and less Facebook. But there's a lot of the same sorts of things. There's a lot more, certainly with people who are today teenagers, it's even more pervasive that your friends have your password and your boyfriend has your password and everybody has your password. And of course you would share your pictures. If you don't share your pictures, it means you don't care about them. So a lot of this peer pressure, I would say, and sharing of digital identities and content that I might be like, no, I'm not giving you that picture, and teenagers are like, sure, whatever, I don't care. So it's a little bit more risky behavior. There are some differences with cyberbullying though, just in terms of, it's, maybe someone in your class who's giving you a hard time, but not necessarily someone who you've had that relationship with. So there is some difference there, but there is some really good work going on in cyberbullying that I'm aware of. So, and there are interactions for sure.
Maybe one last question.
Hooray.
I was curious in the way that you do your research, how do you pick up unintended consequences? Some of the models or prototypes that you test and so on.
That is a great question. The question is, how do we pick up and or think about, deal with, address unintended consequences? So unintended consequences definitely happen where you introduce some new technology with some particular goal. The competition thing in the health worker one might be a good example, where you're introducing something that has got a particular motivational strategy, but that might lead to unintended consequences where people feel, well, I may as well just give up, I'm not winning, and so on, and so it could actually negatively impact things rather than positively impact them, or just things that you didn't anticipate. Most of the time we do this by firstly trying to make sure that we're deeply engaged with organizations who are aware of the context before we do anything and after we've finished doing anything, and so they're in a position to try and at least pick up on what's happening. We definitely do an extensive amount of qualitative research throughout, so not just looking at how people are using things or some of the quantitative data, but talking to people, doing interviews, doing focus groups, debriefing them, trying to understand what's going on, what's happening, keeping in touch with them as the trials are going on, just to try and at least understand. That's it, there's no foolproof way to make sure of these things. I think we do a lot of work, and obviously with ethics boards and so on, to try and make sure that everything that we do is at least much more likely to result in positive outcomes rather than negative outcomes. But we have had unintended consequences happen, and usually they're very interesting. Usually we can actually learn a lot from them and then pivot slightly and address them. But I'm sure they've happened and we've missed some. I'm sure that's inevitable. That's a great question. It's a tough question. We'll end on a tough question.
But with a good answer. Thank you. Let's give a